Hello, thanks for joining us for Season 2, Episode 2 of the Cerulean Skies RPG podcast. This is a weekly podcast aimed at the myriad of RPG subjects that we at Cerulean Skies are passionate about. It's aimed to be a mix of produced podcasting and a live stream discussion, and we always encourage folks to engage with these talks, whether it be in the live chat like Treaky over there first, on the Discord, or through the other aspects of our social media. And this is the second episode of what I like to affectionately call Season 2 since the reboot. Since we had to fire all the good actors and replace them with cheap, shitty Canadian sorry, Majuular, my bad. It's a voice acting thing.
Canadian? How dare you use that pejorative?
My bad. But I'm your host, Joey, and today I'm joined by actual real Canadian Majuular.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Joey. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Hell yeah. And PrettyCody.
Hello, howdy do.
And as we always try to do with new contributors to the show, we're going to be talking about some of our favorite RPGs to get a feel for each other's preferences. But our main topic this evening, it's evening, right? I don't know, there's too much sun, is influence. What or may not influence RPGs or subgenres in the RPG umbrella, the importance or arbitrary qualities of what that means, and what we were doing during the release of some of these influential RPGs. But before we get started, Cody, you're new to the podcast and Majuular. You've actually been on this during Season 1. So, Cody, tell us about your internet presence. Where might we know you?
Oh, you might know me if you stumbled into one of my weird YouTube videos about games that only I like I Am Setsuna or my weird myriad of indie RPG collection. Other than that, I just plink away at all the games nobody likes because somebody has to like them, and that's gonna be me. Yeah, that's about all I got.
Hell yeah. So for some reason, sorry about this. If Cody and Maju were a little bit low at first, first it took my settings and decided to just because I restarted Streamlabs. You never restart Streamlabs ever. Never ever fucking do that. Don't ever do that. Okay. And Maju, how about you, man? Where might we know you on the internet?
I have a YouTube channel that is named after the same name I am named here. So yeah, that's pretty much where I spend all my time. I make videos that also nobody likes. About mostly RPGs, but sometimes like weird point and click adventure games and kind of I don't know whatever is interesting. So yeah.
That's the biggest fucking lie anyone's ever told on this show. That
It's a
nobody
bot
likes.
farm. Every subscriber is a Russian bot, just so you know.
Oh, dude, yeah, we've had a thing with Indian followers here.
Oh yeah.
So a long time ago, back in the ancient days of doing those like long marathon telethon streams, we were doing this big theme about indie games, and I typoed indie as India, and I said, haha, fuck it, I'll leave it. And then as soon as my ex started streaming on there, and she was very white, someone comes in the chat and says, "Are you Indian?" And that's when it began. And then every single time I've used the India tag, some thing like that has happened. And we had some Indian folks also stream with Cerulean Skies. And so I was like, we'll keep it. This is awesome. This is going to be...
It could be a good vein to pursue. I know a lot of the guys who do cooking videos on YouTube when they react to something, if they're reacting to a famous Indian chef, the viewership is like 4 to 5 times higher than it is when they're just talking about Gordon Ramsay or something. So
Dude,
could be something to think about there.
Damn, I think that's sick. Is it? I wonder if it's just like a tag thing or interesting.
I don't know. I think this is a massive generalization, but Indians are just maybe like exceptionally loyal people.
That's why we have 100 followers, because we had some dude come into our chat and say, if you're Indian, I'll give you 100 followers. So that's like, I'll pretend to be something I'm not. That's okay.
Hey, you make a good chicken makhani on here, you're gonna make the right connections.
Yeah, you've
I don't
heard
know
of
what that is, but it sounds great.
lamb roga Josh. Now try lamb roga Joey. I don't fucking know. Anyway,
Hey,
we're gonna talk about some of our favorite RPGs and maybe some of our favorite culinary dishes. And we'll see which one comes first. So, but again, Maju, you were on here before, so you talked a little bit about your favorites. But since you were last here, so that was like about a year and a half ago now. What's an RPG specifically that you've played, if any, that would fall into maybe not some of your favorites, but really good? I don't know.
an RPG I've played since we spoke last. Then,
Yeah.
yeah.
That stuck out to me.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind is Skies of Arcadia. I played that for my channel, and of all the games that I played for my channel, that one like remains to me right at the top, right in the upper echelon of like games that I love and want to come back to. I was really taken by it. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But I mean, uh, yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I've played. Most of the game RPGs that I've played since then have been like related to my channel, and the thing about me is that I always find something to like even when something just like sucks objectively. So even some of like the lamer games that I've played since then, even some of like the cornier, like some of the 3DO games I've played have like stuck with me. But as far as favorites go, as far as games that are actually good and that I'm not ashamed to talk about go, yeah, I would say Skies of Arcadia, probably number one.
This man under his hoodie right now wearing a Lucien's Quest shirt, absolutely rocking the 3DO
It's an
agenda.
all-timer. I was about to put it in the Saturn video, but I'm like, damn, that's right. I already covered it on the 3DO. I can't double up.
You did it. It's funny because I've been playing through the Diablo games, and one of the things that I found out about Diablo 1 was that it had a 3DO port that never actually happened. So that could have been one of your games. And was it the Dreamcast version of Skies of Arcadia or the GameCube one?
So the one I played to completion was the GameCube version, but I got reasonably far in the Dreamcast version because I did a sort of light like quote unquote technical analysis in that video. So I wanted to compare some of like the differences in terms of like video quality and like music quality, which surprisingly there's actually some pretty stark differences between those versions, but GameCube version has more stuff in it and it's like good stuff. So even though you lose the VMU, which is a tough one to say goodbye to, I think GameCube most people consider it to be maybe not definitive, but sort of like the version you would recommend to like newer people.
Gotcha. Yeah. I don't think I ever finished the Dreamcast one, but the GameCube one was really solid. I played that one a lot.
The Dreamcast one is worse in most ways that like people measure it by, but the fact that you're playing it on a Dreamcast is sort of a positive, and I can't really explain why.
I get it, man. You're just a sucker, just a Sega sucker.
That controller feels right. You got to say that about the Dreamcast controller.
You know what? That's a good start button for an RPG menu. You know what I'm saying?
True. It's supple, tactile, just everything you'd ever want.
Nice. A nice nubile start button. Yeah. It's disgusting.
Oh, no.
I'm just trying to make Cody like absolutely cringe. And speaking of Cody, what about you, man? Because again, this is the first time that you've been on this podcast. Tell us a little bit about some of your favorites. And bonus question: have you covered any of your favorite RPGs in any of the videos that you've made?
Okay. Well, some of my favorites are like Earthbound and Final Fantasy IV, the real basic boy Super Nintendo games, but those were really like instrumental in me discovering the genre. So I think those have stuck with me over time, despite the fact that 4's story isn't as good as probably I think it is, but that's okay.
And I haven't recovered any of them for my channel with like the bonus question. I mean, there's more. There's like Live Alive and Star Ocean 2, which I hadn't even played until I started my channel, which is a weird one. But the catch is I'm too afraid to review things I like because I worry I will just kind of gush about them and not say anything interesting.
So
It'll just be like, Earthbound's pretty, and it makes me feel good when the man plays the saxophone on the hill. Next question. Like that.
yeah, that's funny because I want to clip that and then put it over your I Am Setsuna video. I don't cover game, or I forgot exactly what it was, the quote exactly, but it was basically like I don't want to cover games I don't already really like or whatever. So this way, the truth finally comes out, and I'm gonna make a fucking hit video about you, and it's gonna be PrettyCody fraud.
Not so pretty after
Not
all.
so
Yeah,
pretty.
red arrow pointing at him.
You gotta have the
You
big
know.
arrow. And then maybe me in the shadows. That's important too.
First you, and then Pro Jared, and soon I'll kill them all. That's all.
The
Not
rivalry.
literally. It was a Metallica reference, guys. Come on, man.
Oh, right, the seminal. I forgot about that.
Right. Yeah. So, damn. So shit. So, because you have been playing a bunch of Sega RPGs as of late, Maju, right? So, what would, if you gun to your head, which there is now because you're third on my list after Pro Jared, which says a lot about you, really, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's incredibly kind of you.
It's like pulling the gun on Tony Hawk during the race war. You don't want to do it, but you got to.
Sorry, man.
Yeah. So, best Sega RPG.
Oh man. That's. I mean, even from the ones I played, that's actually a really tough question. Best. You could. I mean, there's plenty of arguments to be made about which one's like the greatest. Are we asking which of the games is the greatest, or which one is my favorite?
Oh, don't you fucking do this! Don't you fucking do it!
You gotta draw a line in the sand.
No,
somewhere.
I think what I usually aim for is cute, but also, what I knew I'd get Cody with that one.
It took a minute. I had to, yeah.
I knew I'd get him with that, but no, I think I never really go for the objective question. I feel like I never. I think there is a time in my life when I was deeply searching for that, and I couldn't make it. So I think, yeah, when I say favorite, I mean like your personal favorite. It could be Quest 64 for that matter, you know.
You won't find a Quest apologist in me. You can find one probably in the chat, but that's neither here nor there. I would say the best RPG from Sega that I have played, Shining Force 3 is so damn good. It's such a great game. Like, I just went into it thinking, it's probably going to be like good kind of Fire Emblem-esque, and, people gas it up because it's a Saturn game, which kind of makes it special or whatever. No, this game, this series of games is like just excellent by all the metrics that I measure a game by.
Hell yeah.
So I'd have to say probably that. And if I was being objective, just for the sake of the thought experiment, it would probably be, I don't know, maybe Phantasy Star 4 or something like that. Skies of Arcadia comes close, but Shining Force 3, man, it's a damn good game.
Cody, have you played Shining Force 3?
I have not played Shining Force 3.
Oh, whoa, okay.
I know. This is a shameful admission here.
Mm-hmm.
Played Shining in the Dark.
Oh, that game is sick. Did you play that when you were younger, or like recently?
No, I totally whiffed on most of Sega as a kid. We couldn't afford multiple consoles, so I rolled my dice on the Super Nintendo and lucked out that I had some pretty good games.
That's a good one.
True.
Shout outs to Ghost Wolves in the chat, who put all his chips in the CDI pile, which, ooh boy.
It was the future, man. It was supposed to be the future.
I mean, it could have been sick, maybe, in an alternate timeline. But I think Shining Force 3 is a really good way to segue this into our main topic, because I have something really big to say about that, and we can maybe piggyback off this. But so, again, our main topic is influence in RPGs specifically. And just, I just want to be clear that whenever we talk about, usually when we talk about games on this podcast, we're trying to talk about stuff in the context of RPG specifically. It's a bit tough to do because I think pretty much everybody who comes on this show is super well versed in Vidya, and so it's difficult in a way to sort of encapsulate your thoughts in that genre. And I hope the sound is okay for everybody in the chat. We had some issues here with Streamlabs, because there always is.
I think that's my girlfriend. I think she's driving home right now, so she can't hear it over the sound of her car. I wouldn't worry too much about that one.
Oh, okay. Damn. Okay. Her car.
It rattles.
Yeah. I mean, you're making the YouTube big bucks, or at least you will after this podcast once you go viral or viral.
My ship is coming. Viral.
Yeah. Hell yeah. So, but yeah, I want to bring Shining Force 3 to the forefront here, or at least to just sort of jumpstart our discussion, because I think that game is hugely important. Okay, Toeman John says it sounds good, and with a name like that, it has to sound fucking good. So let's go. So have you guys played any? Well, you just said you have just played Shining in the Darkness, right, Cody? Did you play Shining Force 1 or 2?
Those were the Genesis ones.
Yeah,
I believe I played both of those. So yeah.
Okay,
So,
hell yeah.
I didn't beat them, but I played them.
So, just historically, why is Cody just Cody? You know what? He's. I didn't want to set any expectations. I want the people to decide themselves. I mean, obviously, he's pretty.
It's that Midwestern thing. They just let me be.
They love him. They love him out there.
Sense.
If actually both, this is rare that you get two Midwesterners in a podcast here. It's usually just me and like fucking two losers from Florida. But he's the Cody. He is. But if you look carefully, the gradient of my colors bleeds right into Cody's, which is really sick. And I'm a big fan of that aesthetically. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that was not on purpose, but
You were right to put me alone at the top.
Well, you stand alone. That's like that Godsmack song. Is that Godsmack? I stand
Oh
alone.
no, I knew Godsmack reference was coming.
Oh yeah, it's in the doc, dude. You should have looked. But Shining Force 3, I bring this up because now Shining Force as a series started as a foil to Fire Emblem. It was supposed to be even more accessible to Fire Emblem. The director of Shining Force, Takahashi, I forgot his first name. He basically said something along the lines of, Fire Emblem was never an influence on this game, or whatever. And that's a dirty fucking lie, because even if something doesn't inform your game directly, being in opposition to it, or being a foil to it, is its own influence. So in trying to be contrarian to Fire Emblem, you create baby's first little strategy RPG in Shining Force. I mean that endearingly. I fucking love Shining Force. But I think that's interesting because I'm not mad. I just think it's interesting. I wish that Takahashi would just let me see his phone. If he had nothing to hide, he'd let me read his text messages. But I think it's interesting that Shining Force went from a sort of anti-Fire Emblem to then being incredibly directly informed by Fire Emblem through its map design, through its scenario design, and also through some of its story, and so, like its mid-mission requirements and optional objectives, which Majuular, if you've played even just scenario 1, you know that's the business of Shining Force 3.
Yeah, it's the best part too.
Yeah, it's sick, man. So I'm curious, like let's try to like think about the lineage of that TRPG, right? Like what influence it had. Because like look at the Camelot games that came before Shining Force 3. We have at least the ones that would be more directly informative to it. So Shining the Holy Ark and Shining Force, obviously. But Shining Force was like in this weird state where it put out these two bangers on Genesis, or sorry, Master Drive or Mega Drive. Always
I like
get
the
that.
Master Drive.
Master Drive is like when you hack it, you get that fucking teched out Genesis, dude.
That's me playing Pebble Beach golf links on the Saturn yesterday. I was firing out some Master Drives.
Fuck you, man. Oh, that sucks, but it's awesome. All right. Yeah, so like you look at the games that directly sort of influenced that and what was happening with video games at the time, right? And storytelling in RPGs was starting to become a little bit more prominent, because that game came out after FF7, Shining Force 3.
Yep.
It was like either the end of 97 or early 98. So I'm curious, and this is for both of you guys who want to field this question, is that what do you guys think influenced a game like that? A very like kind of serious SRPG?
Like just sort of the Shining Force series or the Shining series in general, you mean?
Specifically Shining Force 3.
Okay. That's an interesting question, because I can definitely draw a line between every one of Camelot's releases from that time. There's so much that is carried over from game to game with Camelot that it's like increasingly evident playing their games that, okay, this is a Camelot game. I can tell just by like looking at this that it's a Camelot game. A lot of their systems and stuff. But as for what, like, I don't, it's tough to say with Shining Force 3 specifically. Shining the Holy Ark came out probably about 2 years before that. And Holy Ark, that was the first Camelot game where like I feel like really a strong kind of, there's like more of an aesthetic connection between all of Camelot's games henceforth. I think that was the first game where they kind of like really like buckled down and made the Camelot aesthetic. And I think part of it had to have basically been kind of accidental. So I'm thinking like aesthetically, that game is made up of like lots and lots of like 3D renders that have been like digitized as 2D sprites, which results in a game that looks really unique. Lots of companies were trying to do that at the time, but most of them very unsuccessfully. Or you had some attempts at like real-time polygonal 3D. Also, lots of that didn't really go great, at least in 96. That was still kind of like very early in like 3D graphics, I guess, being used in console games. So I mentioned this in a video that I'm working on, where it's like there was something that allowed them to foresee how well their 3D renders would age. It looks like claymation. It looks timeless. It looks like there's a cartoonish kind of animated quality to all of their sprites, where even there's some problems with the way the internal resolution kind of messes with sprite scaling and stuff and the way it's displayed on modern displays anyway. But like in terms of just like pure aesthetic value, those games are like weirdly timeless in a way that makes me think like it almost couldn't have been intentional, because so many of the games that looked like visual powerhouses at the time ended up aging like milk. Not to say that they weren't incredibly talented and didn't have like an eye for detail or anything, but it just sort of was like this perfect like lightning in a bottle. Anyway, all that to say, that's what makes it kind of hard to look at a game like that and say like what would have inspired something like this, because so much of it was just sort of circumstances surrounding like technical limitations. They used technical limitations to create something that looked amazing. Like they worked around all of these different problems And I found it interesting. You said that it was sort of created. The Shining Force series was created in opposition to Fire Emblem, because in my research for my Golden Sun video that I made a little while ago, all I really found on that was what you said, which is them saying no, it had nothing to do with Fire Emblem. Like it's just our thing. We were only inspired by Bukowska Wars and nothing else.
Yeah, Bukowska Wars. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is that's crazy.
it seemed like okay, well I mean, who am I to dispute that, right? This is the only primary source of information I have on the subject, so I kind of feel like I have to take this at face value. But yeah, playing, I played Shining Force 1 and 2 several years ago now, so it's been a little bit. But I do feel like playing Shining Force 3, the story moves in a much more epic kind of, maybe epic is the right word, much more grandiose, much more political, and like much higher level concepts being explored in the story, which is something I usually associate with Fire Emblem, even though I don't have a whole lot of experience with that series. So I feel like it seems like there must have been some kind of influence, if not specifically Fire Emblem, at least a bunch of the other like tactical TRPGs were sort of like the genre that told stories like that, like big political stories, right?
Mm-hmm. And
I feel like it had to have been.
I want to pass this to Cody, but I just really quick, I want to kind of just say that you already touched on something that I want to circle back to, and it's like the arbitrary quality of this whole subject. But I want to hold that I'm not putting that in the bag. I'm putting that in the fanny pack for now.
Okay.
So it's there. You know, I'm gonna forget to even zip it up, but it's in the fanny pack. So
all right.
Cody, how about you? Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, right, 97 is the same year Final Fantasy Tactics dropped in Japan too. So you get these kind of parallels running where they're all kind of talking in these darker, more political tones. And I'm wondering if a little of it's Mitsuno's kind of influence with Tactics Ogre, which what was that, 95? Because he was really pushing the more kind of political stuff for sure. I mean, Tactics Ogre, I'm sure everyone here has played it. Morally Greytown, USA, or Ivalice. Does that take place in Ivalice? I don't know.
No,
but
it's not. Yeah,
it's its own universe. Yeah, I guess there's winged people.
That's a Vagrant story, I think.
It's Vagrant story. Yeah, and 12. Okay. Anyway, so I feel like there might be a little of that kind of echoing off, but I don't really know how hard Tactics Ogre like hit in Japan. I'm not really sure.
It did well. It did really well.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, relative to that genre, you know, I do think that we slept on the mention. I was going to bring this up right away because I know somebody who's going to be listening to this is fucking screaming at the speaker or whatever that they're listening to this on. But how dare we bring up Shining Force 3 and talk about the influence of SRPGs in the Saturn era without mentioning and paying credence to the greatest aesthetic achievement on the Sega Saturn. Majuular knows what I'm going to say, and it's the greatest video game ever made, perhaps. Ronde.
Oh man. Well, first of all, if you look at the back of the box, you'll find that you're actually supposed to pronounce it Rondo. So fake fan alert, everybody.
Oh shit! Just like every other SMT fan, I'm a very fake fan. Yeah. Well, actually, that's technically Megami Tensei, so I wouldn't have known that if I was. So.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Actually, just to hang on that for a second, that's a great example of technically speaking, a developer doing the same thing that Camelot was doing with Shining Force 3, but it being a tragic misstep as opposed to a timelessly beautiful game.
Right. The the Glover 64 to the Mario 64. I don't know. Sorry, Cody.
Yeah.
I think I bisected your thought there.
No, I think we're good. I just wanted to bring up Quest. I think that everything else kind of touches on what Camelot really does that sets them apart from everyone else.
Yeah, that's and like just real quick, like let's strip this to the fundamentals just a tad. Is it possible or even worth it to trace influence in RPGs? Cody, would you say?
Possible or even worth it? I think you can draw through lines, right? I think that kind of stuff muddies, though, especially as things like RPG mechanics just become so popular that they are just across every genre. I mean, you're playing Call of Duty and you're grinding up your numbers to get your guns or whatever, your XP. So it all kind of muddies after a while and sort of becomes more of a flavor than a necessarily distinct thing on its own. But in terms of like, I think it's at least helpful to understand that context. Ironically, harkening back to Majuular's video, I am currently doing research on Dragon Slayer by Falcom for
Oh, that
the
game
script I am
fucks.
working on. And I was like, oh yeah, they traced the Ultima manuals for that. And then I was like, why do I know that? That's so weird. And then, oh yes. So yeah, there's like, you know, those through lines, and I think it's important to kind of understand the context around that kind of stuff. Like, you know, Ultima clearly was an influence on it, even if you can't find those things directly. I mean, they traced the cover or the instruction manual, right? So I think those little bits of history really add in a little bit more of a what's the word I'm looking for? More well-rounded viewpoint on it than you might initially expect.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about the Fire Emblem and Bukowska, Bukowska,
I think it's
Bukowska,
Bukoska.
Bukowska
I'm not
War. Yeah, I think you're right. I'm sorry, dude. I should have probably researched this before. I even put that in my notes here because I was talking about like I wanted to bring that game up actually because it's a huge touchstone for TRPGs or SRPGs. I actually played a little bit of that sucker. It's not.
I heard it stinks to play now.
Oh yeah. All those old boomer games do for sure. I played Dragon and Princess too. That oof. But you know, I that I think is the effect, right? And we can sit here and we can be like, well, Takahashi said this and the game does this, and then you start arguing intent, which is the worst fucking thing that anyone could ever do with art, period. Is like, especially, you know, like a product and a piece of art like a video game being such a collaborative thing, right? You can't be like, well, actually, David Lynch was trying to say this with this, and it's just corny, and it's just never going to get anywhere. It doesn't fucking matter, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the intent was. If it's obscure enough, someone's going to form their own understanding of it, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not trying to get into death of the author shit either, but my point is that this saying one thing and being influenced is saying one thing and actually having a pedigree or lineage of games that came before it that informed it, I think are two very different things. So even if your influence wasn't Fire Emblem, ain't no way Fire Emblem didn't inform some aspect of that game, right? And even if it didn't, something that Fire Emblem was influenced by did. Bukowska Wars did, right? So there's always a little bit of that. And I think it's kind of fun to not necessarily make comparisons, but trace evolution. It's almost like breakpoints. You know what I mean? And I think what happens in comparative analysis often is that people start doing just that, literally comparative analysis, rather than just plotting points on a graph, right? And I think that, to me, that's my favorite thing to do, plotting the points, not trying to say, not trying to draw the line, because that could go so many different ways. So, but Maju, how about you? How do you feel about the question here? Like, is it possible to trace influence, and is it even worth exploring that?
I mean, yeah, it certainly is possible to do it accurately. It's probably like a bigger question. But I mean, like, what I've found, especially doing like the Ultima series, is that so much of the information, so much of the like facts that we take for granted are basically, it's one single person's statement from 40 years ago is like carrying a fact like Atlas upon its back. And a lot of the times, I mean, people have bad memories. Developers themselves with good intentions will say things in interviews that will be taken as truth for many years to come, and there might be some conflicting information that kind of makes that not wash anymore. And I've noticed that especially with Ultima, there are so many things that are taken for granted as truth that you dig a little bit deeper or you find another interview. One of the things that I touched on in I think Ultima 4's case is that there was a guy involved in Ultima 4's development named Ro R. Adams III who was very pivotal to the game, but because we haven't had one interviewer in 1986 conduct an interview with this guy, his legacy is like has been at risk of being left behind. And that really important fact as to the creation of Ultima 4, which itself, I think most people would agree, is an incredibly influential game. His part to play in it and what he did and how he did it, which are all really interesting things if you care about that sort of thing and important. Yeah, it's basically at risk of being lost, because I think most people take for granted that information in all its forms is being recorded at all times. But like the reality is that if everybody assumes that, then what happens is these developers go to their grave without having told their stories, and all of this valuable information that's so important in kind of like constructing our image of video game history, it becomes really flimsy, and we only have really like a partial picture of how these things came to be. So yeah, I think it's possible, and I think it's important to try to trace these things back and to understand where they came from. But I also think it's probably almost impossible to do it with 100% accuracy. So at a certain point, you kind of need to accept that if you're looking into video game history, you're not getting the full story. You can only try to get the best, fullest version of that story as you can, right?
I think if I had to put a point to any kind of subject I'm trying to speak on there, I think what you just said is 100% it. And I think it speaks to both of your guys' videos, and what you have tried to do with the content that you make. Sorry, I used the content word. My bad, y'all. Oops, my bad. But sorry, that's disposable. But no, I think it speaks to the quality of that, and I think there's a reason why people watch that stuff. I think that it could be almost, I don't want to say dangerous. That sounds like, I don't know, anti-intellectual or whatever. But I think that there are definitely people who will watch a video on Ultima and be like, okay, I understand everything now, and this is exactly what is said, and then parrot that information, or you telephone game the information to a wrong three-way call with, like Longmont Potion Castle. And so it's
absolutely. That's so true. It's something I try to be very wary of, because I know I'm presenting a lot of information that some people are going to be just kind of take as gospel. So if I'm presenting something as a fact, or sort of like introducing something into the narrative of how these games were made, I try to basically compare and contrast different sources, and if something seems flimsy, I exclude it or make it like abundantly clear that this is just hearsay. There's like no primary source for this information, because otherwise you get Shining Force was never inspired by Fire Emblem, and how dare you for thinking that for 30 plus years, right?
Right, or like if I were to make a YouTube video with a poorly remembered quote like that Takahashi quote, and like posit it as fact or even opinion without getting it right, that would be pretty dangerous. Not only to the quality of my argument, but also to a bunch of fucking losers on YouTube.com. So it is a little bit of both. And Cody, I want to shift this in your direction too, because while we're on the subject of things that we've made, because I feel like you also have seen this specifically with the I Am Setsuna video that you made, because that game's a big talking point of that video game is this was influenced by Chrono Trigger, and to me, only really the marketing was. I'm curious as to where that falls on the like where influence falls in the realm of I Am Setsuna.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, when I was going through it, it shares a lot more DNA with Final Fantasy X than Chrono Trigger. But I mean, it makes nods to it, right? It's trying to prey on nostalgia in some ways. It's like, here's the cross strike. Do you remember the cross strike? One character has frog ears on her hat, or frog eyes on her hat. Frogs don't have ears? Do frogs have ears? Anyway, the there's two little bumps in Frog Zone on her hat, so they do little nods to it. But for the most part, you can tell that the team wanted to make something kind of unique and new within the framework of these older games. And it really becomes clear when you go to they have a developer room, and there's even a there's even a character in NPC is like, "Hi, I'm one of the devs. I just wanted you to know that I know this isn't perfect, but we really got excited about making this." And it's like that kind of like weird insight that you don't really get on the modern game because they don't have the dev room because it's kind of insane. Do frogs have eyes? That's a great question. I got way off. Do frogs have? Yeah, they have They have two ear bump shapes, but there's eyes in the ear. But anyway, I Am Setsuna is like a game that really brings it all together in kind of a package that wants to nod to these things and kind of like acknowledge the things that came before it, but it's not looking directly to ape it. And I think a lot of people were like really confused, like it's in the snow the whole time. Chrono Trigger isn't in the snow. And it's like, no, they're going for something different. There's a different approach here.
Like Chrono Trigger, but Snow No Trigger or something.
Yeah.
And it's
Stop this, man.
yeah, I need to be arrested. It's fine. I think not to just I guess go off topic, but mentioning I Am Setsuna always brings me down the Octopath path. And I feel like I didn't even fucking try. Oh my God. Oh, I'm sorry. But I feel like that's another good example here is that, where you can see Octopath's influence from a fucking mile away. At least I feel, right? And, you see the 8 protagonists. What does that remind you of? Saga Frontier, Live Alive. Which, by the way, Cody is the only person besides the one who told me how it's pronounced to say that name right on this podcast. So, and then you see it. Like, a lot of people said FF6. I think that's silly. There's like the only thing that FF6 and Octopath really have in common is they have a lot of characters in it. I guess there's very little. Maybe some of the serious austerity of FF6 that's contrasted with some of the goofiness. Octopath does a little bit of that too. But, at the same time, is that influence really something visible? Or is it just something that's iterative, naturally iterative? Where does it fall? At least in the context of that, especially being a retro game, right? Like there's no way, and I'm using that in the literal sense of the word. I always get fucking pedantic about this, but I have to just mention the fact that, when you look at something that's older, that's not retro, that's vintage. You look at something that tries to take the style of something older, that's retro. So I mean that in that sense, because obviously Octopath is not a fucking 25-year-old game, although isn't it like almost 8 years old now?
Oh no.
Jeez.
That can't be true. Don't say that.
6 or 7, I don't fucking know. But it definitely tries to be something of the past, right? And I'm curious as to how you guys think that intersects with influence, if at all.
Cody, do you have like I'm not super familiar with Octopath, so if you've played it, maybe you'd be better at answering this specific one.
I've Octopathed before. Yeah, Octopath, I feel kind of that's the same guy who did the Bravely Default games, right? And those are kind of
Team Asano.
begotten to Final Fantasy V for the Bravely Default games, and the my cat was stretching. Sorry. they both kind of like play in conversation with it, but I feel like they both bring like a lot of quality of life stuff. I think a lot of their interest is kind of speaking toward the value of those older games, not necessarily in so much to like remind you. And it doesn't feel, what's that movie? Ready Player One. It doesn't feel like Ready Player One, where they're like, "Do you remember this? Do you remember this? Do you remember this?" It doesn't feel like that so much as like we have a respect for something that it seems to have been kind of lost, so to speak, or at least not acknowledged as much as maybe it needs to be, or the developers in that case feel it needs to be. So I think it kind of shifts the conversation in a really pleasant way toward like, hey, we find value in these older things. We find like, some kind of credence with these, and it's not necessarily. Sorry, my cat is distracting me.
No,
really
it's
badly.
I was smiling at that. Yeah.
So I feel it changes that a little, and actually it's I think more an attempt to breathe some life into it, which it depends on what your attitude when you approach it is, right? If you're really cynical, I think it'll still fall apart under the weight of like, I've done this. But Octopath, I mean, pretty fresh. Octopath 2, I think was where they really hit their stride for me, but that's another story.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's where there's this sort of divergent path, where even though Octopath 2 is pretty much the same game, it's just a more at least this is my opinion, and I'm trying to use this as an example, but to me it feels like a more polished attempt at the vision, right? Even though it's the same kind of, roughly you're using the same tools. And I'm trying to think of, going back to the SRPG genre too, there are a lot of attempts to try to utilize something that had already been done before, because maybe it was popular, and maybe because it struck a chord creatively or intellectually with its creators. And I think, I mentioned Ronde earlier, but Ronde or Rondo, is it actually, that's what they say it's
That's
pronounced?
how they say it's pronounced, but I mean, take that with a grain of salt, I guess.
Right. It's not fucking Rondo of Blood. That's a different game. You know what I'm saying? That's not a fucking RPG. Come on. And but no, I mean, like, so that's the third Majin Tensei game, right? And for those of you who don't know, Randu Dorman says, "I believe him always, no matter what he says. I believe." But that was the third game in this SRPG series, and Majin Tensei was definitely created to fill some kind of genre gap. A lot of the Atlas spin-offs, the Mega 10 spin-offs were that. It was very product facing. So in your ESL opinion, that's how it sounds in your head. I believe it, bro. But I think that's a, what about like influence within the same bubble? So something like Final Fantasy, right? Or what's anything iterative, anything incredibly iterative. So, Final Fantasy always will take a concept and then just like kind of redo it, right? In FF16, you have some futuristic stuff that kind of seems anachronistic with the world around it, like FF1. Hey, that's like that reference. It's like, it's sort of like a reference to itself in its own way. So the way that, people say, oh, this Final Fantasy is not really a Final Fantasy game, that kind of shit. But then what is, what has influenced it to be like that? I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts about influence within series as they are.
Yeah, I feel like I'll come back to it again because it continues to be a great example for this subject. But I think about Ultima, and I think about how many times an Ultima game has been sort of been largely accepted as the first of its kind in some different way. And I'm always very, very careful when I say like the first game to do blank, because there's always, like you say, in the same bubble, there's always seemingly room for argument in terms of which was the first to do this, which was the first to do that. And every time you think you have the answer, you find out that you're not at bedrock, actually. It gives way. There's more to this discussion. Ultimately, you can go down the rabbit hole until you get to tabletop games, which every RPG mechanic of all time somehow has something to do with that. But with Ultima, yeah, it's interesting, particularly because that's a series that takes place in literally the same world with literally the same cast of characters, game after game after game. You play as the same person. Ultimately, the game is sort of trying to achieve the same, like the simulation of life in this world, but in very different ways. And there have been like certain offshoots of Ultima, like Ultima Underworld, for instance, went in a completely different direction. One of the most formative, like 3D games ever made. Like what again, one of the most important games ever. Preceded Wolfenstein, but was like a 3D real-time RPG that took place from a first-person view. And it's that was made by a different studio, but even so within Ultima, it's hard to say like it's hard to say when you it's just like aping another game, right? It very, very much feels to me like it is an iterative process. It feels like you can't really boil it down to like a handful of influences even. It's part of the reason that I'm so caught up in those videos about like kind of describing the culture at the time, what was going on in the like the industry and everything, is because I think that really strongly affects the ways that things turn out. Even if Richard Garriott, the creator of Ultima himself, wasn't directly inspired by whatever Pool of Radiance, chances are very good that 15 of his employees who were helping him with design and programming were. So it very much feels like kind of there's the sum of many different moving parts that are really difficult to like pin down and like itemize. So you can have a couple of games that are clear influences or that have been stated as influences, but yeah, I don't think it's really possible to like sum all of that up. Even unconscious influences itself a whole giant subject that like right there it's like the number of like potential different things that you like stole from for your ideas is basically endless. I last when was that? We're doing Super RPG Friends maybe, but you guys had said something about in my videos you were talking about a mutual friend of ours, Drewby, and his Final Fantasy retrospective series available on youtube.com, and are kind of talking about how some of my Ultima videos, I think he and Frank were saying like, oh, it's interesting, sort of in a cheeky way, like, oh man, it's like you took these ideas after me, and I was like instantly my reaction was, no, I didn't. But then I thought about it, and I'm like, who am I to even say that? Like, who am I to say that that had no influence on me, right?
Yeah.
I am a collection of things that I watch and am interested in, and it's entirely possible that watching some of his videos had like a strong influence without me like recognizing it.
Yeah, Carl Jung is just like sitting up in his seat being like, I fucking told you guys that everyone has it in them. You know, y'all connected to the same mosaic.
Get out of here, Carl. Of your horse shit.
He's been dead for a while. He had some problems, man. You know how it is. But
Oh no.
yeah, I think that you brought up Ultima too, and I think this is important, and I kind of wrote this a little bit down, is the trajectory of Western RPGs versus JRPGs. And Cody, how do you think that compares, first of all? Like, if you look at JRPGs, and I'm using, someone's going to fucking get annoying about this term, but y'all know what I mean. If you look at JRPGs or RPGs made in Japan from 1980 to 1994, that's my arbitrary cutoff year, versus Western RPGs, or RPGs made in the West from 1980 to 1994. What do you think is the biggest difference in evolution, if any?
Yeah, I mean, from all the stuff, it really depends, right? Everything, of course, gets granular and branches out. A bunch of research I did for a video that I didn't end up making was roguelikes with the original Chunsoft team, and it was because one of the devs at the place was obsessed with Rogue, the old PC game, and that's what they ended up using as like the basis for Torneco's Mystery Dungeon, which was the original like roguelike mystery dungeon game. And like what makes it so cool is that like it feels like its own thing, right? Like they definitely took the ideas and springboarded off of them in an interesting way. But generally speaking, from what I can tell, Western RPGs really value that tabletop experience, right? Where you have a lot more choices and a lot more player agency. And then JRPGs kind of got into the like the manga sort of thing, which probably doesn't help that Hori and all those guys came from like manga, right? Like they wanted to tell those stories, those give you that power fantasy and back in the day through obsessive grinding, but you know, they wanted you to get that kind of that trajectory of like, oh, I've put in the work and I've become powerful, but the story was always pretty singular. So it's kind of interesting to see that sort of stuff divide in that way. Um, Not to say that there aren't, you know, JRPGs with a lot of choice in them, like the Saga games, for example, are really open-ended. Uh, I'm sure they're fun too. I haven't played one in a long time. I don't know anyone here who's even played one, so
Yeah,
that's
so
kind of
I
crazy.
haven't. I haven't.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I'm just a fucking, I'm just a giant poser. I actually clipped stuff from David Vink's video and put it into mine.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's. And yeah, actually, funny enough,
An eye for an eye.
Yeah, hell yeah, dude. Well, I am going blind, so it kind of form follows its function. But Dylan last week he was on this podcast and he did mention Mystery Dungeon too. He got fucking big time Mystery Dungeon pilled by Sheeran, which was like a you know
The new one?
yeah
I'll bug him in chat. I'll bug him in the chat. I'll get to the bottom of this. You got a real mystery dungeon head over here. Let me tell you.
We played the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom one first because he's a real one.
Okay.
And this is my reminder that all our VODs are up on the YouTube and on the Spotify and all that good stuff too. If anyone ever wanted to cross-reference Mr. Dylan in the chat, you can do that there. But yeah, no, I think that you're definitely onto something with player choice and also but power fantasy too though. I feel like that wasn't absent from
No, the genre definitely is just all power fantasy, right? Number go up kind of thing.
yeah. I mean, and it's a little bit more than that too because I mean, Majuular, you speak on this because obviously I've only really played like 30 minutes of Calibeth and Ultima 6 or 4 for Super Nintendo. I think it was 6 actually. Now I'm thinking about it, 6 for Super Nintendo. So
Yeah, it's sorry, like what did you like specifically mean? Like
oh yeah. Like what's the power fantasy in a JR like the boomer JRPG versus a WRPG?
Oh, okay. Oh, this is goody. This is interesting. Okay, so like using Ultima as an example, there's two people who are really, really important in that series. Richard Garriott, obviously, for making it, but also Warren Spector, who became involved with Origin and went on to make. He was involved with the like Looking Glass Studios games like Thief and System Shock, and he is was the director on Deus Ex, which is like largely considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. Oh, yeah. And what you see in those games, and basically the precise moment he became actively involved with Ultima as well, that what Garriott and what Spector wanted out of Ultima, which I think they can sort of speak for much of like the Western RPG games niche at the time, was simulation, was basically giving you tools and having them operate in ways that you would expect and allowing you to like solve problems in ways that would invoke creativity, that would like necessitate problem solving in ways that physically make sense. So just as a very, very basic example, you've got a locked door. You can pick the lock, you can find the key to open the door, or you can drag an explosive barrel next to the door push a cannon from the castle wall inside this room, fire it at this explosive barrel, and this big oak door blows wide open. And you feel like rewarded for breaking the rules basically of the game. I think that's a lot of where the power fantasy in Western RPGs, Cody was, I think, right to identify like tabletops having a big influence on that. Because what do people do when they play tabletop games? They light inns on fire and they kill quest givers and they just do crazy stuff because they can. And to suspend your disbelief enough, it's fun to, participate in a world like that. Whereas I think, like, as a generality with JRPGs, a lot of the power fantasy comes from very, like, curated moments of sort of, like, the power fantasy is being orchestrated by the people who make the game. It's building up to this point, and, it makes you want specific things to happen in the story or in the battle, and then in the perfect moment, something does happen. You summon Bahamut when all of your characters are about to be dead, and just the bombastic end of a great battle, or you're made to lose a battle against an unwinnable foe, and then 60 hours later you come back and beat his ass. That's all very curated. You have no agency in how that turns out, but it's also incredibly satisfying to be able to participate in that kind of like fantasy that they're weaving for you, right? So I'd say it's like player agency probably is like the best way to put it. Sort of simulation versus just participating in a story that's being told.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback that, Dragon Warrior, the old NES one, when you rescue the princess and return her to the throne, she goes, "Dost thou love me?" And if you say no, she goes, "But thou must." And the yes no box pops back up until you tell her you love her. Weirdly, if you tell her you don't love her like 900 times, but then say you love her at the end, she's like, "I'm so happy." And then a little song plays. But like, yeah, it's that's the experience they had intended for you. They gave you the box because they thought there's no way you'd say no anyway.
Right, and that goes to the final choice of the game too. Spoilers at the end of Dragon Warrior / Quest 1. You get the final boss hits you with, you want to join me and we can like kick some ass together, and then you can say yes, and you can, and if you do, he just like yeets you out of the castle, and you basically just, it's almost like you're getting like a knockout, or like essentially it's not even a game over, because there's no black screen. It's like you just get yeeted out the castle. So I think that's like a perfect, that's so much more curated, and it's really hard to argue freedom within the confines, right? Because you could easily say that, oh well, a lot, even Ultima, you might have these choices to do this and this and this, but you're still only given a couple options to do it, and blah 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 blah. But like, you fucking know what we're talking about. Like, people get so, I heard this shit about Baldur's Gate 3 and it drove me bonkers. Is that somebody was saying Baldur's Gate, somebody who had never really played a CRPG before, was basically saying Baldur's Gate 3 is so unique because you can do all these different things to fight enemies and blah blah blah. It's just D&D, it's just D&D rules or whatever, if you look at it that simplistically. But then somebody else was like, yeah, well, you still have choices in a game like Final Fantasy VII. The choices, they mean just as much. And it's like, do you fuck Shadowheart, or you not fuck Shadowheart? It doesn't, it's the same thing as picking the date at the gold, that kind of, at the gold saucer, that kind of shit. And it's like, you fucking know what I mean. You know what I mean. Don't get like that. Oh, I hate that stuff so much. But oh yeah, because you get to carry. Yeah, you carry her back, the princess, too. Forgot about that.
You hand deliver her, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
there's the while it's in my brain, one thing that is kind of interesting I find about the player choice, like the more like the choices you actively make, sometimes in JRPGs that incorporate player choice, those choices are actually much more subtle when they happen. Like, it's less sort of like there's a defining moment of choice that will affect the outcome of the situation. It's like less of a choice in gameplay and more of a choice in how things pan out. with Shining Force 3, that game is actually very, very full of choices you can make that do affect things like related to the gameplay, especially later on. But um, unless you're staring at a walkthrough the entire time, you don't really know what those choices are because they're woven so organically into the game. It's like it's a family of refugees you can save at this part of the game, and if it's really, really fucking hard to do that, and if you do, they say thanks and then they leave, and you're like, oh man, this is a game. I thought I was gonna get a badass reward for like doing this crazy optional challenge. Um, but like the rewards yielded from that and the like game changing aspects are actually much more subtle and like don't occur until much later on, sometimes different in a different game entirely.
Yeah, literally. I mean, the choices that you make in Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 carry over into both games. And well, if you carry your save over, and they're pretty drastic. Like you could miss whole characters, get a whole different scenario. I guess sequence of events that play out, and that was definitely informed by a lot of. I would say It's funny because I think Shining Force 3. This is a good touchstone to keep coming back on. So this way, Cody has to play it, and then and then you also will get forced to play Scenario 2 and 3 Majuular. 'Cause that's a long ass game to play, and it's in totality for sure, though. That definitely
The big one.
but like yeah, I think that like a game like that is way more influenced by Western games than even like JRPGs, right? Because Shining Force 1, if you look at it, is very much like a Dragon Questification of that genre. It was meant to be a lot more accessible, sort of power fantasy-esque, where you can grind to your heart's content. And that was a very deliberate choice on the developer's part because they wanted to allow that kind of thing from happening. Whereas Fire Emblem, in the beginning at least, was very much the antithesis of that. Like the game is designed to be mission based, and where you can't just, I mean, you could exploit the systems, sure, but the game is not deliberately designed for where you can grind Marth up to level 99 and watch as he just OHKOs the entire map. And they didn't do that. They did that with Salif and FE4 because that was different. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting how you see those kind of things weave in and out of one another. And I'm curious as to what you guys would think. And Cody, I'll toss this to you again. Is that moving forward for RPGs in the future, how do you think games made in the last couple years will inform what comes after? What qualities, if any, do you think will be carried over into the next wave of RPGs?
It's a really good question. I think what's really interesting is the success of the Souls games has really kind of pushed this renaissance of looking backwards toward like FromSoft and those kind of guys' libraries. And you get a lot of those older games in that territory that sort of were less willing to hold your hand in a lot of ways. And I think you're kind of seeing a little bit more of that echo through a lot of the genres. Specifically thinking in terms of like the old, again, I don't think anyone here's played it, but Shadow Tower.
Oh yeah,
And it's mix of
No, not
genres.
me.
Yeah, a rare game. No one's ever really heard of it, but it kind of like takes that same thing and sort of in like the sense of mystery, and you see that like even with the new Zelda Breath of the Wild, where it's kind of back to dropping you in and having you kind of explore that. So I think it's interesting painting that more largely, that like we're kind of looking at these old game ideas that we had sort of abandoned for like yellow paint on a ledge and all of that sort of stuff, and asking ourselves like how much do we want to allow people to feel like they're really understanding the world on a very fundamental level as a player versus going to a theme park and kind of being walked through a line of like exhibits and sites. And they're also, I think, not afraid to make them more challenging. There was like a PS3 baby mode era for a lot of mainstream games that was just sort of like, You could just sort of mash the button and look away, which every once in a while I'm in the mood for. Don't get me wrong. I'm not hating that as an idea, but it's kind of cool to see this new sort of understanding of the value of some of that older stuff, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that you're starting to see a more disparate or almost like a binary with that stuff now. Either a game has none of that or it has all of that, right? You know, a game like Elden Ring is hugely successful and it doesn't have any of that. I mean, you could argue, oh, you have the ashes, you got the fucking summon. You know, you can argue all that stuff affects the difficulty and it's sort of that game's version of it, and sure, but you know what I mean. You know, in terms of like a hard option, either games don't have any, like Elden Ring, or they have 8 million, like the Baten Kaitos remaster that lets you one shot everything if you want, you know, or the FF7 or the FF ports that, or the Pixel remasters even, that give you the boosters and the all the little quality of life options and the speed up and all that kind of stuff. So I think, I definitely think that I don't know if we're like necessarily sidestepping the PS3 baby mode thing, but I definitely think that's influenced a lot of how to move forward with accessibility and with reach, I suppose, in that sense. So I don't know. It's like, but what about a game like Baldur's Gate 3, right? You know, what is that? You almost have a CRPG-esque renaissance now. I guarantee it's going to take it'll take a little while to get there fully, but it's like we didn't really see the feedback of a game like Persona 5 until about a year and a half, 2 years after it had come out and done really well, right? And we were talking earlier about Shining Force, a game that's insanely UI forward. Look at Shining Force's UI. That shit is beautiful. Look at Shining in the Darkness's UI. That shit is beautiful. You know, people like at the time that shit was probably hitting, okay, maybe not Persona 5 level, but it was kind of hitting on those same brain cells and firing the same neurons, right? And how much of that is like a fundamental aspect of game design? How much of that is just an iterative aspect of game design? I'm not really sure in context of RPGs. But Maju, how about you? How do you think games specifically? It doesn't have to be bigger games, actually, because I think I'm fucking up and only really mentioning these big influential games. But how do you think RPGs released in the last couple years will inform RPGs in the next 10 years?
Yeah, well, yeah, hitting on more of the CRPG side, it comes back again to that sort of that idea, the Warren Spector dream while he was making Deus Ex of having a game where you could sort of cook up solutions to problems constructed by developers and have them pay off if you manage to think of them. And there's like many different potential ways to solve problems. To me, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is basically the purest expression of that we've had in video game form, to the point where this sort of niche genre that is CRPGs, that is the sort of ethos of immersive sims that's until recently been like really kind of only touted by like a small group of people, that game is basically like transcendental. In most of the time when a game comes out that's so big, you think, okay, well, we don't really know how like influential it's going to be for another at least 5 years. I think Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games where it's like, okay, this has basically just changed the entire genre, and we can all kind of recognize it right now while it's still in front of our noses. So I think when it comes to CRPGs, and I do think that there has been a bit of a CRPG renaissance in, say, the last 10 years, to be really generous, but like during that PS3 baby mode era, like Western RPGs, it was pretty touch and go. There's not a lot that was coming out of that front outside of like the Elder Scrolls that was really enthusing a whole lot of people. And it seemed like the desire for that type of game was dead. But I think if anything, that once you started getting, Kickstarter, where now you didn't have to rely on sort of publisher instinct for for how what types of games could come out. You got like Pillars of Eternity and what's it called? Tyranny. You've got like these games for lots of like sort of Obsidian games coming out. And finally, kind of culminating in this release of Baldur's Gate 3, I think it's proof that what they were trying to do with CRPGs all the way back in the Ultima space, even with their limited technology, this like ability to cook up, dream up solutions, have your choices that actually matter. Yeah, Baldur's Gate 3, I think, is just made it very, very hard to sell people on a CRPG henceforth. I think it's going to be pretty tough to release sort of like a high budget classic styled CRPG without having it be compared to this incredibly like complex and ambitious game. So I think it's good because there should be more CRPGs in this world, and I think RPGs where choices and consequences are actually engaging and actually make like qualitative differences to your experience are really important, and it's hard to get them right, and it's great when they are right. So I hope it does like push some developers into that kind of direction, RPG developers. But it's gonna be it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be a very difficult standard to maintain. But
Yeah.
I do believe that it's gonna be probably the most influential RPG that's released over the last at least let's say 5 years.
They even mentioned that specifically, basically saying, hey, don't expect the industry to release CRPGs that have this level of polish and scope and ambition. And it wasn't even them saying, look how fucking good our shit is, bro. It wasn't grandstanding or self-aggrandizing or whatever. It was a fact of the industry, a fact of economics, a fact of whatever. Because even if Baldur's Gate 3 sucked, that was an unrealistic expectation for a lot of developers moving forward. And I think gaming is kind of hitting this weird plateau almost. And I think, the long tail is stretching so long that sooner or later that shit's gonna snap
untenable.
back. Yes,
It's untenable.
100%, dude. And I'm worried as to where what falls in the middle there, because that's kind of scary, and that stifles a lot of influence too, because then influence becomes something more like a necessity. You need to have a game that looks like Baldur's Gate to sell. And this has always been a problem, right? This has been a problem since games in the 80s, in the early 80s, that games have to look like big titles. They have to have the essence of this. This is how genres happen, right? And though that's like that's a scary thing to think about, I feel, in a lot of ways. Yeah. Cody, you're gonna say something?
Oh no, I was just like thinking about like to your point, like it's 6 years now, I think, for a AAA game to turn around.
So yeah, something like that.
But yeah, you get Baldur's Gate. I think early access really helped that out. I'm hoping to see that kind of. I mean, I know sometimes it just fails miserably, but there's good sides to it too.
Yeah, and also I do think that there is still some level of like hopefulness to be had from that, because even so, and Baldur's Gate came out after these games, so you have games like Pentiment or games like Disco Elysium where there is a high level of interactivity, and there's a high level of like player choice and involvement, and sort of living up to a lot of those dreams of the classic CRPG. But those games were made on budgets that weren't ludicrous.
Right.
Those games were possible. There is a lot of hope, I think, in the indie scene, perhaps not to be quite as big a runaway success as Baldur's Gate 3, because you're always going to need to have those few developers who just have infinite resources to like push technology to whatever capacity it can be. I see there is some usefulness in like the Red Dead 2s of this world. Like there is value in being able to create a more kind of insanely granular simulation. But at the same time, I think a lot of people who truly care about the genre will be happy to see smaller developers, indie developers, mid-budget developers with publishers, which I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, but like these sort of like just like double A games being able to take a page from these big RPGs and maybe not making the most like 100-hour long games with the best graphics, but being able to like focus that in on the things that actually made Baldur's Gate 3, for instance, good, which was, you know, just the interactivity, the joy and surprise of trying things out and seeing them kind of like working the way that your brain would expect them to. I think indie developers are like insanely creative. And when I think about RPGs outside of like, yeah, Larian and like From and a very small handful of devs, that's where like my hope for the future of the genre comes from. If ever there's going to be a renaissance of any type of great genre from ages past, I mean, gonna likely start with indies and then maybe some cigar chomping fat cat sitting somewhere will go, hey, I don't really get this shit, but the kids like it. Maybe let's start doing that instead.
Yeah. That's the Vanillaware's future, I feel, is that, you know, someone's gonna some guy, some fat cat that you just described. I don't know if y'all hear that, but my neighbors upstairs, apparently they're fucking throwing boulders.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's shot put season, and you know they're in. But Jesus, but yeah, no, I think yeah, someone out there is just willing to buy Vanillaware, man. You know, that's the future of gaming is Vanillaware. It's my agenda.
You know what? It wouldn't be the worst possible outcome.
I mean, giant balloon tits, you know, with like really awesome gameplay. You know, that's all you really need.
Yeah. There was only like okay, no, there was more than a small handful of giant balloon tits in Unicorn Overlord. Never mind.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
They're sneaky about it. They wait a little bit and then they're like, meet the elves.
Well, you know what? Scarlet got me in the beginning of that game because I didn't realize.
Oh, that's true.
It.
It's your childhood friend, yeah.
But I didn't realize
right
it.
out
Like the way her character is designed, I was like, oh, that's just like her. Oh, those are her. That is the entire bust. Okay, that makes sense.
Turtleneck sweater, man.
Just contain that? No, that doesn't work. So I'm curious. Like we are running a little bit close to time, but I want to have one little kind of thing before we sort of wrap up, and it's for one of the games on y'all's favorites. You know, let's break down what maybe some of the influences there could be. And so I'll pick Ease because I'm basic. And also, I think it's in not direct contrast, but I think it's an interesting contrast to what the early 80s, super late 70s, even PC RPGs were doing at the time. And it's, you know, all those games were trying to be very deep and dense and trying to give you all these choices. And then, you know, I mean, granted, you can say that Dragon Quest and some of those games were a little bit, even Dragon Slayer to some extent, were trying to be a little bit more accessible, a little bit more straightforward, streamlined, whatever. But then Ease comes along and it's like, you don't even have to worry about attack and stuff, bro. You just walk right into shit. You know, it's so almost opposite that experience that it almost feels oppositional. Right. And I think one of the coolest things about that game ain't no fucking way that game wasn't influenced by a lot of the same shit that, I mean, even, you know, that even the Wizardry devs were playing at the time, you know, that Richard Garriott was probably fucking with. Actually, that man is a bizarre human, so maybe not. I don't know. But Cody, you were saying Dragon Slayer. You kind of, if you've done research on this and you've already seen like how much even like calculator games influenced that kind of stuff, like you know, it's wild. So I think about action RPGs and how that sort of spread out, and then I think of Ease, and I'm like, why is this just so untalked about? And even playing something like Diablo now, which I've been playing on stream. Not 20 minutes before this stream because I forgot we were doing this stream. I would never do that. It definitely, I could see some of the Falcom stuff in there. And again, whether intentional or not, it doesn't matter. Things evolve and things change because things change and technology improves and creativity is distended and extended, and it's cool to see all that kind of stuff. So I don't really have a thesis here. That's kind of just my thing. Ease comes from boomer shit and also is a direct answer to boomer shit. Anyone got a game that they want to bring up? It's Spotlight, I guess, in this.
Take it away, Cody.
Okay. For me, an interesting one is Mother. It takes Dragon Quest pretty much wholesale in a lot of the systems and the way it does it, but it really felt like it had a much more Mother 2 more so for me personally, but like Mother 1 in terms of like really, I think pretty nakedly inspired by early Dragon Quest games. Like you're fighting in a void of darkness, but they've just shifted everything over to this story that's really trying to tell something a lot more poignant and a lot less. Well, it's pretty epic in scope, but it's not your fantasy typical dragons and swords thing. It really wanted to have a conversation with you about, like, I think those games, what really makes them shine is way less the gameplay and more you feel like you're having a conversation with the author in the way that you do with like a book, where you're like, I'm kind of learning something about this person and their thoughts on the world. It's all kind of coming through here. So I always thought that one was a really interesting one in terms of like picking up its influences and doing something kind of new and unique and putting a fun little twist on it. And a final boss that's a man's memory of a movie that scared him when he was a kid. So yeah, it's just overall very fascinating to me.
Bro, and if you flip it upside down, it's like a dude jacking off. So I really quickly, before I pass this to Majuular, I want to say, I see people are going to trace that lineage to Earthbound to Undertale, right? That's the logical conclusion that everybody draws. That's the end of that's the equation. But to me, I see Earthbound's biggest influence. Is this kind of a cheater answer? But the biggest influence that Earthbound had on another game was Pokemon. And hear me out. It's the setting. It's like a weird modern setting that has some sort of anachronistic things. A lot of the same writers, same kind of dialogue, almost, not all of it. A lot of it's like for babies because the game is designed for children. And, that's not pejorative. That's just like literally, like you talk to some of the NPCs, they're like, press A. And then you open up your menu. Like you're not just pressing A and whatever. So, but that being said, there's a lot of like goofy social commentary in what the NPCs have to say, with some of the plots in that posit. I mean, even Team Rocket, that whole plot, the plot to be the very best, all that kind of shit. There's a lot that Pokemon takes. And again, that's cheater because a lot of the same devs worked on it. But I just think that's an interesting interstitial area that I never hear people talk about. I don't know. Anyway, Maju, what you got?
I'll rep the WRPG here. Some of my favorite CRPGs would be like the original 2 Fallout games, as long as we're kind of like looking backwards. And game-wise, they were spiritually succeeding a game called Wasteland, which was
right.
Obviously would have been inspired greatly by a lot of the other CRPGs coming out at the time. But Fallout's always been an interesting one because I think it's so now accepted in, like, if you're even passingly familiar with Fallout, its aesthetic, its sort of like vibe is, we all kind of know it, the Vault Boy, the 50s Americana mixed with Mad Max, mixed with kind of like old kind of Ed Wood style science fiction goofiness. But like for them to have done that, as like to approach the game with all of those thematic influences at a time where such a thing would not have been done, it would have been a hard sell to make the first Fallout game. I think is really, really impressive. And I was on a podcast recently with Indigo Gaming, and he said, so I'm just going to basically copy verbatim what he said, was that like what Fallout was, or what Fallout is to this day, like what we see as Fallout was crystallized in the very first game, which you usually do not
Right.
get in series. Usually it takes at least a couple of games before they get it. But it was like, yeah, just to have the primary influences for the game be things outside of video games, I think is really made for like a really interesting, really eclectic game that we now kind of take for granted. But yeah, but yeah, think of yourself back then pitching this idea for this like post-apocalyptic game, and it's a serious CRPG, but also it's like a black comedy and includes like it's like Doctor Who and Mad Max and all these different things. But it doesn't feel like those are all disparate elements. They all feel totally like where they belong in Fallout. It doesn't feel like a scatterbrained approach. So yeah, for a series whose influences were like so out there and zany, the fact that it itself has become such an influential series is I think it's very, very commendable in a way that's hard to appreciate removed from it by 30 years now.
Hell yeah. And you know, it's funny because I feel like Disco Elysium is a little bit of that too when you're talking about devs kind of almost being influenced outside of their wheelhouse, right? Because Disco
Yeah.
Elysium wasn't originally a game, it was like a novel, right? It was originally conceptualized as a novel and then it eventually morphed into that. So it's kind of similar. It's funny how that kind of stuff works.
hmm
Yeah.
Especially with RPGs, it's a lot easier to, I think, it's a lot easier to be influenced outside of things like games when you have an RPG because it's like, it's such a, it's a genre that sort of invites lots of different, it invites many different themes, many different types of characters, many like different ideas you've got kind of floating around your head. So it's a lot easier to just like pick things out from TV shows or movies or art or whatever that you've seen.
Right. And last question that I really have for you guys is, do you think, this is kind of maybe a general or stupid question, I guess, but I'm just curious. I'm just picking the brains a little bit. Do you guys think that developers now, like in the future, like in the immediate future, are more or less inspired than they were in the 80s, in the early 90s?
Man, that's a big
Not
big
it.
question. Yeah. I think that devs are probably more inspired but like less nakedly inspired, I would say, because a lot of the RPGs from those older days, you did have to go outside of the genre um in order to like incorporate different elements into the game because like there was no sort of like generalized approach to a lot of different things. Nowadays, I think that the games that inspire, well, yeah, nowadays, actually more to the point, video games aren't made anymore other than indie games, but like big games, the big games that are talked about in magazines and stuff, they're not made by 8-person teams of friends in a garage with computers with Apple IIs set up who order pizza every night and drink Diet Coke. Nowadays, those games are made by thousands of people, many of whom are not in the same office, many of whom don't even know each other and never will meet each other. So it's much harder to trace inspiration back when you have a very like assembly line kind of development cycle. So I think games are just as inspired than ever, but I think it's about 100 times harder to actually corner those inspirations because many of the people themselves who work on the games don't consider themselves like the creator. They're yeah, I don't know. It's like a lot of cells working together as opposed to one person who watched like a Red Wheel of Time or something and decided they wanted to make a game with their buddies about it. So, yeah, complex question, but there's my non-answer for you.
I thought that was a good answer. I can piggyback on that a little bit
Hell yeah.
though. Like they back in the day, the 8 guys in the garage, they didn't know what was going to work. So I think there was a level of excitement to just throwing everything at the wall. But with the big games, magazine games, I like that. I'm going to start calling them magazine games. Like they know what works and what doesn't, and they have so much money in it, they can't take the risks, and they can't have that kind of level of excitement. But I think a lot of that passion's still there though, especially when you look at like half these indie games are like, yeah, I worked at Activision for 4 years and then I just went and made Axiom Verge or whatever, and I have this really cool thing and it's just inventive and unreal. And yeah, I downloaded a game on the Steam sale that you start with an egg and you hatch it. It's like a Tamagotchi on Game Boy Color, and then it turns into Monster Rancher after that. After you've hatched it, you have to raise it and train it and battle it. So like you have to care for it in like a weird virtual pet way and then battle it. And like, I think people are still out there just trying everything. I don't know if the game works. I haven't played it, but it looked cool.
Tricky asks, what game?
It is called Yolk Heroes, a long tamago, which I think means egg in Japanese. So Yolk Heroes, a long egg.
Yeah, like
But yeah, you literally hatch a hero, like a Dragon Quest hero, and you raise him out of an egg, like you do. But yeah, like that's insane, right? Like if you pitch that to Activision, they'll kick you out the door.
yeah. This stream is sponsored by Yoke Along Tamago. Thank you for that. No, that
That's where
sounds
their
really
entire
cool.
budget went.
Yeah. That's why we were kind of late today. Why we kind of flumbled it. I was waiting for to hear back on the sponsor, basically.
Yeah, we had to make sure that we got that ad break fit in there.
Hell yeah. So no, that was really insightful. Thank you guys. That was. Thanks for the sharing. I think this is a good topic too because sharing some of the history that I'm like intricately aware of, despite having grown up on CRPGs. I mean, I obviously played more JRPGs first, but I got a PC when I was 12 and played Diablo and Baldur's Gate super early on, and that was like amazingly formative to me. And one interesting anecdote that I have before we close out and ask if you guys have anything else that you want to touch on is that I don't even remember which group chat it was. One of my group chats said something about Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 being an RTS. I was like, what? Those games are the same. Whatever you'd consider Baldur's Gate 3, that's what Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are. I mean, maybe you move...
In essence, yeah.
You move around a little bit more like an RTS, sure. Like the UI might look a little bit more RTS-y, but it's the same kind of concept. It's still turn-based. It still uses D&D rules and modifications. It's not as in-depth as BG3, of course, but it's the same genre. There's no difference, really. To me, at least. Maybe you could sub-genre it, I'm sure. Like, you can say, like, I don't even fucking know, because Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 also have that, too. So, I was kind of, sort of, not, like, annoyed or anything. I don't mean it like that, but it just, whoa, people would think that? I don't know. It's still kind of wild that something that relevant, would be a little bit, I don't know, veiled? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the difference that user interface and just general presentation makes. You strip all that stuff away, I think it's a lot easier for people to see what it is. But with it there, I mean, I think, one look at Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, I can understand why someone who's grew up playing Age of Empires or StarCraft would be like, oh yeah, it's like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what kind of sold me on StarCraft, because I was like, oh, you move around like Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
So I get it in a way, but like that's a 12-year-old brain. So I don't know. That was not shade. I just fucking came out that way. I guess backhanded is always the way to go. But either way, anything else that you guys want to just touch on or speak to real fast before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. It was a good conversation, but I'm spent. I've said all I needed to say, and I can finally go home to my planet now.
Hell yeah. Cody, how about you?
Same. I think this was really good. I enjoyed talking about it, but I I covered all my things.
Oh yeah. Thank you guys so much for hanging out today, and thanks to everybody in chat for listening. Anyone who else is listening or watching on the VOD or on the Spotify or the Podbean or what have ye. Real quick, where can we find your guys' stuff? Give me your plugs. That's what I'm asking for. Maju, we'll start with you.
Sure. You can find me on youtube.com/Majuular. You can also find me on Twitter at the same thing. You want to, mostly just shit post about nothing, about video games. But yeah, that's where you can find me. I am hoping to have a Sega Saturn video out by the end of this month. Not hoping to. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. It's a
Hell
big
yeah.
one. So if you like Saturn games, please look forward to it.
Hell yeah. And Cody, how about you?
I am PrettyCody on YouTube. That's where I put out the bulk of my content. I stream a little bit here on Twitch, like once every time I get the weird manic urge here at twitch.com/PrettyCody. And I am on Twitter at HeyPrettyCody, Hey_PrettyCody. Fun fact, a lot of people think that they are the PrettyCody, so I didn't get that name.
Damn, that's a fucking bummer. We couldn't get Cerulean Skies, just Cerulean Skies. So I had to do Cerulean Skies live, and it makes me fucking cringe every time
Brutal.
I see it. I didn't know what else to put. I really didn't. I panicked.
It's a
and
good compromise.
But it's like, I don't know. It also looks like Live. It's the Live Alive thing. It's actually a reference to a game that 6 people played. It not a lot.
Perfect.
So Cerulean Skies Live Alive. I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, go ahead and follow these guys. Give them argue with them on their videos. If you ask them enough times, you'll get the Dark Souls retrospective. Believe me, I know this for firsthand information.
But you have to keep asking though, or else I won't know that I should do it.
Exactly. Thank you guys so much for hanging out and for this. This is a lot of fun, and we do this every Wednesday at the same time at what time is that technically? 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Wait, no, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I can do math. Yeah, again, thanks everybody in chat for hanging out. We're going to shoot a raid on over to Sarzak. He's doing, funny enough, Majuular's favorite game, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. So say hi.
It's not my favorite.
Ooh, there we go. Yeah, thank you guys again, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And in tomorrow we got more Diablo, and more Diablo this weekend. We're gonna be playing a really hit game called Diablo Immortal that everybody likes. I've never played it, so we'll see what happens. I hope you guys have phones, and I hope y'all have fun. Take care.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Bye.